The Weight of Silence, a journey from sacrifice to self-discovery. I learned to swallow my words before I learned to speak them. Growing up as the eldest daughter in the Morrison household meant carrying invisible burdens that grew heavier with each passing year. My parents, David and Margaret Morrison, were the kind of people who spoke in measured tones about sacrifice and family duty, their voices carrying the weight of expectations that seemed to multiply like shadows at dusk. My childhood was painted in shades of compromise. While my younger brother Jake received new clothes for each school year, I wore hand-me-downs from distant cousins, the fabric soft from too many washings but still carrying traces of someone else's life. When he wanted guitar lessons, the family budget somehow expanded to accommodate his dreams. When I expressed interest in art classes, the conversation shifted to practical concerns about our financial situation. I learned early that my desires were luxuries we couldn't afford, while his were investments in his future. The pattern established itself so gradually that I mistook it for normalcy. Every family gathering, every holiday celebration, every major decision revolved around Jake's needs, his schedule, his preferences. I became the family diplomat, the one who smoothed over conflicts and ensured everyone else's happiness. My role was to be understanding, to be flexible, to put everyone else's needs before my own. It felt natural, even noble, to be the one who held everything together. College offered a glimpse of what life could be like when my choices mattered. I thrived academically, discovered a passion for psychology, and built friendships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. But even then, the invisible tether to home pulled tight whenever my family needed something. Emergency loans for Jake's car repairs, last-minute babysitting for my cousin's children, emotional support for my mother's various crises, I provided it all willingly, believing that this was what love looked like. After graduation, I returned home with plans to save money before pursuing graduate school. What I thought would be a temporary arrangement stretched into years, as my family's financial needs seemed to expand to match my earning capacity. I worked double shifts at a local clinic while Jake explored different career paths, each new venture requiring family investment and emotional support. My parents spoke proudly of his entrepreneurial spirit while treating my steady income as a given resource rather than a personal achievement. The guilt was insidious. Every time I considered moving out or pursuing my own goals, subtle reminders of family loyalty would surface. My mother's sighs about how expensive everything had become, my father's comments about how families should stick together, Jake's casual mentions of his latest financial setbacks, all delivered with just enough emotional weight to keep me tethered. I told myself I was being a good daughter, a responsible sister, a team player in the complex game of family dynamics. Years blended together in a haze of other people's priorities. I watched friends advance in their careers, travel, fall in love, buy homes, start families. Meanwhile, I remained frozen in adolescence, my life on permanent pause while I waited for the right moment to claim my independence. That moment never seemed to arrive. There was always another crisis, another need, another reason why leaving would be selfish. The romantic relationships I attempted withered under the weight of my family obligations. Potential partners grew tired of canceled dates due to family emergencies, of conversations dominated by other people's problems, of my inability to commit to plans that extended beyond the next family crisis. I began to wonder if I was fundamentally flawed, incapable of the kind of love that didn't require constant sacrifice. By my 30th birthday, I had saved over $40,000 that I planned to use for graduate school. The money sat in my savings account like a promise I'd made to my younger self, a tangible reminder that someday I would pursue my own dreams. I had researched programs, prepared application materials, and even scheduled meetings with potential advisors. For the first time in years, I felt hope stirring in my chest like a bird learning to fly. The call came on a Thursday evening in October. Jake's voice carried that familiar note of controlled panic that had become the soundtrack of our family's financial crises. His latest business venture, a food truck operation, was failing. He owed money to suppliers, faced eviction from his apartment, and needed immediate help to avoid bankruptcy. The amount he needed was staggering, nearly $30,000 to cover his debts and give him a fresh start. My parents had already mortgaged their retirement savings to help him launch the business. They couldn't afford to lose more. Jake's voice broke as he described the shame of failure, the weight of disappointing everyone, the fear of starting over with nothing. He painted a picture of desperation that tugged at every protective instinct I developed over 30 years of being his safety net. The family meeting convened the next evening. We sat around the kitchen table where I'd done homework while my parents discussed Jake's needs, where I'd eaten countless dinners in silence while conversations swirled around his latest achievements. The familiar dynamic reasserted itself immediately. My parents looked at me with the expectation born of decades of compliance. Jake's eyes held that mixture of vulnerability and entitlement that had always made refusal impossible. "We know it's a lot to ask," my mother said, her voice heavy with the martyrdom she wore like armor. "But you're the only one in a position to help. Your job is stable, you don't have a family to support, and you've always been so good about putting family first." My father nodded gravely. "It's an investment in Jake's future. Once he gets back on his feet, he'll be able to pay you back with interest. This could be the thing that finally launches his career." Jake sat silently, letting their words do the work of persuasion. I recognized the strategy: present my refusal as a betrayal of family values while positioning his failure as a temporary setback rather than a pattern. The pressure was subtle but overwhelming, a tide that threatened to sweep away any resistance I might offer. I heard myself agreeing before I fully understood what I was doing. The words tumbled out with the automatic compliance of 3 decades of conditioning. Yes, I could transfer the money. Yes, I understood it was a loan, not a gift. Yes, I believed in Jake's potential and wanted to support his dreams. The relief in the room was palpable, washing over me like warm water that couldn't quite reach the growing cold in my chest. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom, surrounded by remnants of the person I'd once planned to become. Dance recital ribbons shared wall space with academic achievement awards, while college textbooks gathered dust alongside forgotten art supplies. My phone glowed with banking notifications as I transferred nearly my entire savings to Jake's account, watching my dreams convert to digital numbers that would disappear into someone else's fresh start. The weeks that followed revealed the true nature of what I'd agreed to. Jake's gratitude lasted exactly long enough for the money to clear his immediate debts. Once the crisis passed, the promised repayment plan became vague suggestions about future possibilities. When I gently inquired about timelines, I was met with defensive responses about pressure and trust. My parents reminded me that family wasn't supposed to keep score, that my focus on repayment revealed a troubling selfishness they'd never seen in me before. Meanwhile, graduate school deadlines approached like distant thunder. I watched application windows close one by one, each missed opportunity a door slamming shut on the future I'd carefully planned. The counseling psychology program that had seemed within reach became a fantasy, relegated to the same category as childhood dreams of becoming an astronaut or a famous artist. Jake's food truck lasted another 6 weeks before he abandoned it entirely. The money I'd given him had disappeared into a black hole of poor planning and optimistic assumptions. He moved back into our parents' house, occupying his old room while talking about his next venture with the same enthusiasm that had preceded every previous failure. No one mentioned repayment anymore. The subject had become radioactive, too dangerous to approach directly. I began to feel like a ghost haunting my own life. At work, I moved through my days with mechanical efficiency, providing care for others while feeling increasingly disconnected from myself. Colleagues invited me to social events that I declined out of habit, claiming family obligations that had become indistinguishable from prison bars. The few friends who persisted in trying to maintain contact eventually gave up, worn down by my consistent unavailability and emotional distance. The holidays that year were particularly brutal. Jake entertained the family with stories of his latest business idea, while I sat quietly, watching my parents beam with pride at his resilience and vision. No one acknowledged my sacrifice or its impact on my life. The money had simply vanished into the family mythology, becoming another example of how we all supported each other through difficult times. Spring arrived with a cruelty that felt personal. Social media filled with updates from former classmates who were advancing in their careers, buying homes, celebrating promotions and achievements. I found myself avoiding platforms that reminded me of the parallel universe where I'd pursued my own goals instead of funding someone else's dreams. The contrast between their progress and my stagnation became too painful to witness. It was during this period of isolation and regret that I met Drive. Sarah Chen. She came to our clinic as a consulting psychologist, and something about her presence immediately caught my attention. She moved through the world with a quiet confidence that seemed both familiar and foreign. During our brief interactions, she spoke to me with a respect that I'd almost forgotten I deserved. One afternoon, as we shared coffee in the break room, Chen asked about my background. The conversation that followed was the first time in years that someone had shown genuine interest in my experiences and aspirations. When I mentioned my abandoned plans for graduate school, her response was immediate and surprising. "It's not too late," she said simply. "I know it feels like you've missed your window, but paths to education and career change are more flexible than people realize. What stopped you from pursuing it?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. I found myself telling her about my family's financial crisis, framing my sacrifice in the familiar terms of duty and love. But something in her expression made me pause. There was no judgment, but there was also no automatic acceptance of my narrative. "That was generous of you," she said carefully. "How did it feel to give up something so important to help your brother?" The question pierced through years of careful rationalization. How had it felt? I realized I'd never allowed myself to fully experience the grief of that loss. I'd been so focused on being understanding, on being the family hero, that I'd never acknowledged the rage and disappointment that lived beneath my compliance. Our conversations became a weekly refuge. Dr. Chen didn't push or lecture, but she asked questions that forced me to examine assumptions I'd never questioned. She introduced concepts like emotional boundaries and family systems that gave me language for experiences I'd never been able to articulate. Slowly, I began to understand that my family's dynamics weren't normal or healthy, despite their veneer of love and togetherness. The revelation was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. If my family's treatment of me wasn't acceptable, what did that mean about everything I'd believed about love and loyalty? If my sacrifices weren't heroic, but rather symptoms of dysfunction, how could I make sense of the last 30 years of my life? Summer brought Jake's next crisis, delivered with the same mixture of panic and entitlement that had preceded all the others. This time, he'd gotten involved with a multi-level marketing scheme that promised quick returns on investment. He needed just $15,000 to secure his position and begin earning the income that would, he assured us, solve all his financial problems permanently. The family meeting felt like a rerun of a bad movie. Same kitchen table, same expectant faces, same assumption that my resources existed primarily to solve other people's problems. But something had shifted in the months since I'd started talking with Dr. Chen. The familiar pressure felt different now. Less like love and more like manipulation. "I can't do it," I said quietly. The words hung in the air like a foreign language. My parents exchanged glances of confusion and concern. Jake's expression shifted from surprise to hurt to anger with the speed of someone unaccustomed to hearing no. "What do you mean you can't?" my mother asked. "You have a good job, and it's not like you have major expenses." "I mean I won't," I clarified, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "I've already given Jake $30,000 that was never repaid. I'm not comfortable lending more money without some guarantee of return." The reaction was swift and predictable. Jake launched into a defensive monologue about how the previous loan had been an investment in a legitimate business, not a gift, and how circumstances beyond his control had led to its failure. My parents joined in with reminders about family loyalty and expressions of disappointment in my sudden selfishness. I listened to their arguments with a detachment that surprised me. The words that would have once sent me into spirals of guilt now sounded hollow and manipulative. I could see the patterns that Dr. Chen had helped me identify. The emotional blackmail, the gaslighting, the assumption that my needs were always secondary to everyone else's wants. "I understand you're disappointed," I said when they finished, "but my decision stands. I won't be providing any more financial support without a formal agreement and realistic repayment plan." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake stormed out, slamming the door with the dramatic flair he'd perfected in adolescence. My parents sat in stunned silence, looking at me as if I'd revealed myself to be a stranger. "I don't know what's gotten into you," my mother said finally. "This isn't the daughter we raised." Her words stung, but they also clarified something I'd been struggling to understand. The daughter they'd raised was designed to serve their needs, not to pursue her own happiness. My compliance had been so complete that they'd never considered the possibility that I might have my own dreams and boundaries. The weeks that followed were the most difficult of my adult life. My family's treatment of me shifted from disappointment to outright hostility. Phone calls became arguments about my selfishness and betrayal of family values. Jake stopped speaking to me entirely, communicating only through our parents when absolutely necessary. The guilt was overwhelming at times, a familiar weight that threatened to drag me back into old patterns of compliance. But I also experienced something I'd never felt before: the solid ground of my own boundaries. Each time I said no to a request or guilt trip, I felt a small spark of pride that grew stronger with repetition. I was learning to distinguish between love and manipulation, between family loyalty and self-destruction. Dr. Chen helped me process the complicated emotions that arose during this period. The grief was real. I was mourning the loss of relationships that had defined my identity for 30 years. But underneath the sadness was something I'd almost forgotten existed: hope. With my family no longer consuming my emotional and financial resources, I had space to rediscover who I was outside of my role as the family caretaker. I began reading again, something I'd abandoned years earlier. I took weekend trips to nearby cities, exploring museums and cafes without having to check in with anyone or justify my choices. I even went on a few dates, awkward at first but gradually more comfortable as I remembered how to prioritize my own happiness. The application deadlines for the following year's graduate programs became beacons on my horizon. I threw myself into research with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been dying of thirst and suddenly found water. Psychology programs, social work degrees, counseling certifications. The possibilities stretched before me like a buffet after years of starvation. My savings account began to recover as I redirected the money I'd been spending on my family's emergencies toward my own future. Each deposit felt like a small victory, a concrete step toward the life I'd always wanted but never dared to claim. The confrontation I'd been dreading came in early fall. Jake showed up at my apartment unannounced, his charm dialed up to maximum intensity. He'd been thinking about our relationship, he said, and realized how much he'd taken me for granted. He was ready to make things right, to show me the respect I deserved. I listened to his carefully crafted apology with the analytical skills I'd developed through months of therapy and self-reflection. Every word was calculated to push my emotional buttons, to reactivate the guilt and obligation that had controlled me for so long. The old me would have melted under the assault of his manufactured vulnerability. "I appreciate you coming to talk to me," I said when he finished. "But words aren't enough anymore. If you want to rebuild our relationship, you need to start by acknowledging the impact your actions have had on my life." His mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the anger underneath. "Impact? I asked for help during a difficult time. That's what families do for each other." "You asked for help repeatedly without ever offering to help me in return," I corrected. "You've never asked about my dreams or goals. You don't even know what I wanted to do with the money you borrowed." The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. Instead of my usual role as the accommodating sister, I spoke honestly about my feelings and experiences. Jake tried every manipulation tactic in his arsenal: wounded pride, righteous indignation, appeals to family loyalty, promises of future change. But I held my ground, responding to each attempt with calm clarity about my boundaries and expectations. He left angry, muttering about how I'd changed and not for the better. But for the first time in our relationship, I felt like I'd been honest about who I was and what I needed. The relief was intoxicating. My parents' reaction to my newfound assertiveness was more complex. They alternated between guilt trips about family unity and grudging respect for my independence. My mother, in particular, seemed torn between disappointment in my rebellion and pride in my strength. During one tense phone conversation, she admitted that she'd always worried I was too accommodating for my own good. "I just never thought you'd go this far in the other direction," she said. "This isn't the other direction," I replied. "This is the first time I've ever stood in the middle." Winter brought acceptance letters from 3 different graduate programs. The moment I opened the first email confirming my admission, I burst into tears of relief and joy that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than my conscious mind. After years of believing it was too late, that I'd missed my chance, that my dreams were selfish luxuries I couldn't afford, I was finally going to become a therapist. The news prompted the first genuine family celebration I could remember that centered around my achievements. Even Jake managed a grudging congratulations, though the tension between us remained unresolved. My parents expressed pride, mixed with concern about the practical challenges of returning to school at 32. But their concerns couldn't dampen my excitement. I had savings, I had a plan, and most importantly, I had reclaimed my right to pursue my own happiness. The acceptance letter became a daily reminder that it's never too late to change direction, to stand up for yourself, to choose growth over comfort. Spring brought preparation for the massive life change ahead. I gave notice at the clinic, received heartfelt congratulations from colleagues who'd watched my transformation over the past year, and began researching housing options near my chosen university. Each practical step felt like another small victory over the voices in my head that insisted I was being selfish and irresponsible. Dr. Chen and I had our final session a week before I was scheduled to move. She'd become more than a mentor during our year of conversations. She'd shown me what it looked like to live with healthy boundaries and authentic self-respect. "I'm proud of how far you've come," she said during our goodbye. "But remember, this is just the beginning. Graduate school will present new challenges and opportunities to practice these skills." She was right, of course. The work of maintaining boundaries and prioritizing my own needs would be ongoing, requiring constant attention and adjustment. But I felt equipped for the challenge in a way I'd never been before. Moving day arrived with the golden light of late summer. As I packed the last boxes from my childhood bedroom, I found artifacts of the person I'd once been. Journal entries full of dreams I'd abandoned, letters of acceptance to programs I'd never attended, photographs of friends I'd lost touch with while prioritizing family obligations. I decided to keep some items and leave others behind, a symbolic gesture that felt like honoring both my past and my future. The girl who'd written those journal entries had been naive in some ways, but she'd also been brave enough to dream. The woman I'd become was finally ready to make those dreams reality. My family gathered to see me off, the mood a mixture of pride, concern, and unresolved tension. Jake and I managed a stiff hug, both of us acknowledging that our relationship would need to be rebuilt from scratch if it were to survive at all. My parents promised to visit once I was settled, though I suspected they were still adjusting to the idea that I might build a life that didn't revolve around their needs. The drive to my new city felt like time travel. With each mile, I moved further from the person I'd been and closer to the person I was becoming. The radio played songs I'd forgotten I loved, and I sang along with a joy that felt almost foreign after years of careful emotional regulation. Graduate school was everything I'd hoped it would be, and more challenging than I'd anticipated. The coursework was demanding, requiring me to examine my own psychological patterns while learning to help others navigate theirs. My classmates were a diverse group of people who'd found their way to helping professions through various paths, many of them involving their own journeys of healing and growth. For the first time in my adult life, I was surrounded by people who understood the importance of boundaries, who recognized manipulation and codependency as learned behaviors rather than expressions of love. My story of family sacrifice and eventual awakening wasn't unique. Variations on the theme appeared in almost every case, study, and personal narrative we examined. The work was intense but fulfilling in ways I'd never experienced. Each theoretical framework we studied gave me new language for understanding my own experiences and those of the clients I hope to serve someday. Family systems theory, trauma-informed care, attachment styles. Concepts that had once been abstract became tools for understanding and healing. My relationship with my family evolved slowly during this period. Phone calls became weekly rather than daily, and I learned to redirect conversations that veered into old patterns of guilt and obligation. Some interactions were easier than others, but I could feel myself growing stronger with each boundary I maintained. Jake surprised me by calling during my second semester to apologize. Really apologize, not the calculated manipulation I'd grown accustomed to. He'd started his own therapy after hitting another financial and emotional bottom, and was beginning to understand the impact his behavior had had on our family dynamics. "I never thought about what I was taking from you," he admitted during our conversation. "I was so focused on my own problems that I didn't see how much you were sacrificing." It wasn't a complete transformation. Years of entitlement don't disappear overnight, but it was a beginning. We started having occasional conversations that felt more like actual relationship than like negotiations over resources and obligations. My parents took longer to adjust to the new dynamic, but eventually began expressing genuine interest in my studies and future plans. My mother even admitted that she was proud of my courage in changing direction, though she still worried about the practical challenges of starting over. During my final semester, I completed an internship at a community mental health center that specialized in family therapy. Working with clients who struggled with similar dynamics to those I'd experienced gave me a deep appreciation for how difficult it is to change entrenched patterns, but also hope for what's possible when people commit to growth. One client in particular reminded me of my younger self, a woman in her 40s who'd spent decades managing her extended family's crises while neglecting her own needs. Watching her slowly learn to set boundaries and prioritize her own well-being felt like witnessing a small miracle. "How do you know when you're being selfish versus just taking care of yourself?" she asked during one of our sessions. "Selfishness is taking from others to meet your needs," I replied. "Self-care is meeting your own needs so you can show up authentically for the people you love." The distinction had taken me years to understand, but it had become the foundation of everything I'd learned about healthy relationships. Graduation day arrived with the kind of perfect spring weather that feels like a benediction. My parents drove up for the ceremony, their pride evident despite their lingering concerns about my unconventional path. Jake couldn't make it due to work commitments, but he sent a card with a handwritten note acknowledging my achievement. As I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I thought about the 30-year-old woman who'd been too afraid to disappoint her family to pursue her dreams. The journey from that person to this moment had required me to dismantle and rebuild my understanding of love, loyalty, and self-worth. The job search that followed was competitive but ultimately successful. I found a position at a practice that specialized in family and trauma therapy, working with people whose stories often echoed my own in various ways. Each day brought opportunities to help others recognize their worth and develop the skills to protect it. My new apartment was small but entirely mine, decorated according to my preferences, filled with books I wanted to read, organized around routines that served my needs rather than managing other people's crises. The simple pleasure of making decisions based on my own desires rather than family obligations never lost its novelty. 1 year after graduation, I received a call that tested everything I'd learned about boundaries. Jake was in crisis again, a failed relationship, mounting debt, and threats of legal action from creditors. The old, familiar panic in his voice triggered every protective instinct I'd spent years learning to manage. "I know I don't have the right to ask," he said, his voice breaking with genuine desperation, "but I don't know where else to turn." This time, however, I was able to offer something more valuable than money. I gave him the name of a financial counselor and a therapist who specialized in helping people break cycles of self-destructive behavior. I offered emotional support and practical advice without offering to solve his problems for him. "I can't bail you out financially," I told him clearly, "but I can help you find resources to build skills you'll need to handle these situations in the future." He was disappointed, and part of me felt the familiar guilt at his distress. But I also felt proud of my ability to offer genuine help, rather than enabling behavior that would ultimately make his problems worse. The phone call ended with tentative plans to meet for coffee when his immediate crisis had passed. It would be the first time we'd seen each other in person since I'd moved away, and I was curious to see how our dynamic would unfold in this new context. Our conversation over coffee 2 weeks later was unlike any we'd ever had. Instead of talking around problems or dancing around uncomfortable truths, we spoke directly about the patterns that had defined our relationship. Jake acknowledged his history of financial irresponsibility and emotional manipulation. I owned my role in enabling his behavior by consistently rescuing him from consequences. "I think I was afraid that if I stopped taking care of everyone else's problems, they wouldn't love me anymore," I admitted. "And I was afraid that if I actually had to handle my own problems, I'd fail completely," Jake replied. The conversation wasn't a magical cure for decades of dysfunction, but it was honest in a way our family had never managed before. We agreed to work on building a relationship based on mutual respect rather than need and obligation. That evening, as I sat in my apartment grading assessment forms from new clients, I reflected on how different my life had become. 2 years earlier, I would have spent the day consumed with anxiety about Jake's crisis, researching solutions and calculating how much money I could spare. Instead, I'd offered appropriate support and then returned to my own life with a clear conscience. The work I was doing felt meaningful in ways I'd never experienced before. Each client who learned to set boundaries, who discovered their own worth, who broke free from patterns of codependency or people-pleasing, reminded me of the courage it takes to choose growth over comfort. My relationship with my parents had also evolved into something healthier, though it required ongoing maintenance. They'd gradually learned to respect my boundaries, and I'd learned to offer love without sacrificing my own well-being. Holiday visits became occasions for genuine connection rather than exercises in managing other people's expectations. During one such visit, my mother pulled me aside for a conversation that had been years in the making. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I think we asked too much of you for too long. We treated your kindness like it was unlimited, and that wasn't fair." Her acknowledgement meant more to me than any financial repayment could have. It represented a recognition of my worth as an individual rather than just a family resource. "I needed to learn how to say no," I replied. "That was my responsibility, even if it was hard. But we should have made it easier for you to have your own life," she insisted. "We should have encouraged your dreams instead of just depending on your sacrifices." The conversation continued for hours, covering years of misunderstandings and unspoken resentments. It didn't erase the past, but it created a foundation for a different kind of future. As I drove back to my apartment that evening, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge or dramatic confrontations. The healing had happened gradually, through thousands of small choices to prioritize my own well-being while maintaining love for my family. My practice continued to grow, and I found myself specializing in helping people navigate similar transitions from codependency to healthy independence. Each success story reinforced my belief that it's never too late to change direction, to choose yourself, to build a life based on your own values rather than other people's expectations. 3 years after graduation, I received an invitation that would have once sent me into spirals of anxiety and obligation. Jake was getting married, and he wanted me to be part of the wedding party. The old me would have immediately said yes, regardless of my own feelings or circumstances. The new me took time to consider what level of involvement felt authentic and sustainable. I decided to attend as a guest rather than a bridesmaid, a choice that allowed me to celebrate his happiness without overcommitting to emotional labor I wasn't prepared to provide. The decision disappointed some family members but felt right to me, and I'd learned to trust my own judgment over other people's expectations. The wedding was actually beautiful, and I found myself genuinely happy for Jake as I watched him exchange vows with someone who seemed to see and appreciate the person he was becoming rather than the person he'd been. His bride was apparently instrumental in encouraging his journey toward greater responsibility and self-awareness. During the reception, Jake sought me out for a private conversation. He thanked me for the way I'd handled his crisis the year before, acknowledging that my refusal to enable him had been exactly what he'd needed, even though it hadn't been what he'd wanted. "I know it took courage to say no to me," he said, "and I know it was probably harder for you than just giving me the money would have been." He was right. Learning to disappoint people I loved had been one of the most difficult skills I'd ever developed. But it had also been one of the most important, allowing me to offer genuine support rather than temporary fixes that ultimately made problems worse. As I drove home from the wedding, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. 5 years earlier, I'd been a woman who believed her worth was determined by her usefulness to others. I'd sacrificed my dreams, my financial security, and my sense of self on the altar of family obligation. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. There had been months of guilt, periods of loneliness, and moments of doubt when I'd wondered if I was being selfish or cruel. But gradually, I'd learned to distinguish between love and enablement, between loyalty and self-destruction. My apartment had become a sanctuary rather than a temporary stopping point. The walls were covered with diplomas and certificates that represented my achievements rather than mementos of a life lived for others. My bookshelves held texts on psychology and personal growth alongside novels I read for pleasure. My calendar was filled with appointments with clients, social plans with friends, and blocks of time reserved for my own self-care. The work I was doing felt like a calling rather than just a job. Each day brought opportunities to help people recognize their own worth and develop the skills to protect it. Many of my clients were women who'd lost themselves in caretaking roles, and I could offer them hope based on my own experience of reclaiming agency over my life. One client in particular reminded me of my younger self. Sarah was a 45-year-old teacher who'd spent decades managing her aging parents' affairs while her siblings lived their own lives without interference. She came to therapy feeling exhausted and resentful but guilty about her anger. "How do you stop feeling responsible for everyone else's happiness?" she asked during one of our sessions. "You start by taking responsibility for your own," I replied. "When you model healthy boundaries and self-care, you give other people permission to do the same." Working with Sarah and clients like her reinforced my understanding of how common these patterns are, especially among women who've been socialized to prioritize others' needs over their own. Each person's journey toward independence was unique, but the fundamental challenges were remarkably similar. The financial stability I'd built through my career was perhaps the most tangible measure of my transformation. My savings account had grown beyond what I'd lost to Jake's crises, and I was able to make decisions based on my values, rather than economic desperation. I'd even begun investing in a retirement account, planning for a future that belonged entirely to me. More importantly, I developed emotional stability that didn't depend on other people's approval or appreciation. The anxiety that had once consumed me when family members were upset with me had diminished to manageable levels. I still cared about their feelings, but I no longer believed I was responsible for managing their emotions. My social life had expanded to include people who knew and valued me for who I was, rather than what I could provide. Friendships based on mutual interest and reciprocal support had replaced relationships built around crisis management and emotional caretaking. The difference was remarkable. Conversations that energized rather than drained me, plans that were kept rather than canceled for family emergencies, support that flowed both ways rather than only in one direction. During my 5th year of practice, I was invited to speak at a conference about family systems and codependency. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of therapists and social workers, I shared my story not as a victim who'd overcome adversity, but as someone who'd learned to choose growth over comfort. The hardest part wasn't learning to say no to my family's requests, I told the audience. It was learning to say yes to my own dreams and needs. We're often more comfortable advocating for others than we are standing up for ourselves. The response was overwhelming. During the question and answer period, several people shared similar experiences of losing themselves in caretaking roles and struggling to reclaim their independence. The common thread was the fear that prioritizing their own needs made them selfish or bad people. After the conference, I was approached by a publisher interested in my story. The idea of writing a book about my journey from codependency to independence was both exciting and terrifying. It would mean exposing the details of my family's dysfunction to public scrutiny, but it could also help other